Ma'am, that area is restricted. Step away from the door. Lance Corporal Vance's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold, as if he'd been waiting for an excuse to issue an order. Helena Ward stopped, her hand still hovering less than a span from the glass. She gently held out her retired ID card, but Vance barely glanced at it before snapping, "The open sign is wrong. You're not authorized to enter." Helena didn't have a chance to speak before Corporal Harlow stepped forward, arms crossed in open contempt. "Using your husband's ID, huh? We see that all the time." People walking by slowed down, their curious eyes drawn to the blonde woman in a red leather jacket that stood out against the sea of uniforms. Vance snatched the card from her hand, voice rising. "I'll run a check. Do not move." He turned toward the gathering crowd with a triumphant air, as if this were a performance. Harlow pressed harshly. "What's your MOS 369? Helena answered plainly. Both men smirked. A woman in infantry. Terrible lie. Vance leaned in closer, whispering with a threat wrapped around every word. "Impersonating a sergeant major is a federal offense. You want the PMO to cuff you?" Helena stayed silent, not out of fear but from the exhaustion of someone who had heard the same prejudice far too many times. At a distance, Gunnery Sergeant Cole stiffened the moment he heard Vance read the name Helena Ward. His throat closed. That name wasn't ordinary. That was the legend of Firebase Helios. Without hesitation, Cole dialed directly to Sergeant Major Alden. "Two kids are disrespecting a Medal of Honor recipient. Immediate." Inside the headquarters building, Alden and Colonel Rourke looked down at Helena's file. The words Medal of Honor stood at the top like a thunderbolt. The entire room seemed to freeze. "Get the vehicles." "We're going down there," Rourke ordered. And just as Vance loudly declared that Helena's base access was revoked, the roar of command, vehicles tore across the parking lot. Every head snapped toward the commotion, and the air tightened to the point of breaking. If you believe true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the quiet strength of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Veterans' Legacy Stories so we can preserve the memories, dignity, and honor of our nation's quiet heroes. Helena Ward stood still in the circle of scrutinizing eyes, as if the ground beneath her feet had locked her in place despite the noise swelling all around. Her hands rested inside the pockets of her red jacket, fingers unconsciously touching the small metal object, hidden deep within the fabric, a cold, five-pointed steel star. The icy sensation ran along her fingertips, so familiar that it slowed her heartbeat. It wasn't just metal, it was memory, a reminder. Around her, the footsteps of young Marines scraped against the tile floor in a rough, steady rhythm. A draft slipped through the hallway, mingling with the heavy breaths of those who had stopped to watch. Every sound seemed suspended halfway, neither fading nor settling. Together they fused into a silence heavier than gunfire, the kind of silence that makes a person hear their own pulse. Helena did not react. She didn't look at Vance. She didn't look at Harlow. She stood straight, shoulders steady, her expression calm, as if the insults thrown at her moments earlier were nothing more than wind brushing past. But in her eyes, there was something deep, weighted, and worn. A fatigue that didn't come from today, but from a lifetime on battlefields. A flicker of memory opened like an old door nudged by the wind. She didn't summon it. It came on its own. The dim yellow light inside the hangar that day, as she stood before rows of senior commanders, her body still aching from wounds, the scent of antiseptic clinging to her skin, the deep blue dress uniform pressing against the shoulder where a bullet had grazed weeks earlier, the solemn footsteps echoing around her, simple yet ringing, like reminders of the souls who never came home. She remembered the moment the medal was placed in her hand, cold, heavy, and so silent, it frightened her. Because the one who deserved it wasn't there. She was merely the lone survivor standing among a long list of names forever left behind in the red earth of Helios. She remembered the smile of a fallen comrade, the quick laughter during night shifts, the eyes of a boy not even 19 who once told her, "Gunny, I'm scared, but I trust you." Those fragments rose sharply like a flash that stung behind her ribs. Now standing in the noisy open area of the base, Helena heard that silence again. A silence only known to those who have zipped their brothers into body bags. The two young Marines in front of her, in their immaturity, arrogance, and unknowing, could not see the weight resting quietly on her shoulders. Her face did not change, but in her eyes, memories settled like a layer of battlefield mud over everything. A layer thick enough to suffocate anyone who didn't know how to stay standing. Outside, the two Marines were still talking loud, tense, overconfident. But Helena's stillness cut sharper than their shouting. It was a wall dividing two worlds, one built from experience on the edge of life and death, and one built from youth untouched by war. Harlow glanced at her with suspicion, searching for fear in her expression. He found none. Vance waited for a reaction, wanting to see her argue, wanting something to reinforce his fragile sense of authority. But Helena didn't answer. She stayed where she was, letting silence speak. For her silence had always been stronger than shouting, and sometimes far more dangerous. Young Marines in the crowd began to sense something was wrong. No one stays that calm when threatened with losing base access. No one looks straight into chaos without flinching. The way Helena stood, the way she centered her weight, the way she breathed evenly, all of it reflected a discipline no one could fake. She touched the metal star again. A small gesture, but to her it was a reminder that she had faced things far more terrifying than the stares of two inexperienced Marines. She had once shielded wounded men with her own body. She had dragged 3 casualties out of a hail of bullets. She had once believed she might not make it home. And now being misunderstood and insulted was only a small, temporary note in the long, uneven song of her military life. Not a single word left Helena's lips. But her silence unnerved those around her more than any argument could. And in that very moment, as Helena's stillness began to thicken the air, the worst was about to unfold, because public humiliation always finds its way to those who refuse to raise their voice first. Vance stepped forward, his voice tightening as if he wanted to flaunt his authority before the growing crowd. "You're causing a disturbance, ma'am. Blocking the entrance, arguing orders, drawing attention. You're the one making a scene, not me." The accusation flew out fast and sharp, like a blade cutting straight toward Helena. She remained still, her shoulders unmoving, but Vance took that silence as defiance. He raised his voice even louder, forcing everyone nearby to turn their heads. "I'm confiscating your ID right now. If you don't hand it over, I'll call the MPs to cuff you and escort you off this base." A few people in the crowd startled. Some nodded instinctively, as if believing a young lance corporal was easier than believing a calm woman standing quietly in the middle of the concourse. Whispers rippled outward. "She's probably a dependent." "Yeah, they always use their husband's card. She doesn't look military at all." Those murmurs were like pebbles thrown onto still water, sending insult in widening circles. But Helena didn't answer any of them. She simply stared ahead, unblinking. Seeing her silent Vance felt even bolder. He stepped closer and reached out as if ready to grab her jacket. "Give it here," he ordered. "I told you you're violating regulations. I have the authority." But the moment his hand brushed against that red leather, Helena felt a different kind of cold run down her spine. Not fear, not anger, but memory. The red jacket. The last gift her platoon gave her before they dissolved at Firebase Helios. One rough movement of Vance's hand tore open the curtain of time, dragging Helena back into the heat and gunpowder of the battlefield. The ambush from all sides. The explosion that went off at her feet. The scream of the young Marine collapsing beside her. Her hands trembling as she tried to keep the blood from pouring out of the wound in his stomach. The helicopter too far to reach in time. The bitter taste of dust and sweat. The faint, shaky sound of an apology whispered by someone dying. "We pooled our money together for this jacket, Gunny," her assistant squad leader had said when he handed it to her after she returned from medical care. "So you'll never disappear in a crowd. So you'll remember we're still here." The jacket became a promise, a memorial, a part of her body. And now the hand of a young Marine who had never seen war was touching it with unconscious disrespect. Helena drew in a slow breath. Her eyes shifted. The calm was still there, but beneath it was a sorrow that did not weaken, a sorrow held up by the resolve of someone who had stood before death and not broken. That resolve made the crowd, which had been edging closer behind Vance, suddenly hesitate. Vance didn't notice the change. He only saw that she still wasn't reacting, so he pushed harder. "This is your final warning. Hand over the ID. Now. You've caused enough trouble." Harlow stood beside him, arms crossed, eyeing Helena as if she were an obstruction. He let out a mocking sigh. "You should know better. A real sergeant major wouldn't behave like this." Those words might have crushed someone else. But to Helena they felt like dull scissors. Not painful, just exhausting. Exhausting to prove the truth to people who refused to see. Exhausting because ignorance was always louder than experience. Exhausting because she was too used to being judged by her appearance, her gender, and everything unrelated to a soldier's worth. She didn't speak, but her eyes, heavy with sadness and tightly held patience, spoke volumes. An older veteran in the crowd bowed his head slightly when he saw her gaze because he recognized it. That was the gaze of someone who had endured a loss that couldn't be spoken. Vance, however, still didn't see it. The young Marine was creating a wound, without even knowing he held the blade. The crowd began to split. Some started sensing something was wrong, but none had the courage to intervene. No one stepped forward. No one spoke until a gust of wind blew a scatter of dry leaves across Helena's feet, a small sign that made Vance tense up as if even nature were silently opposing him. Helena lifted her eyes, a gentle but deep look, and in that moment, Harlow faltered just slightly. But Vance, drowning in the illusion of authority, missed the warning entirely. She kept her hands in her pockets, touching the metal star again. A small gesture that reminded her she had endured horrors 100 times worse, and survived. And just as the humiliation reached its breaking point, something quiet but decisive was happening elsewhere. Something about to pull the entire story in a direction none of them expected. Gunnery Sergeant Cole remained pressed against a stone column in the distance, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding at the entrance of the base exchange. He watched every small movement Helena made and every wave of arrogance rolling off the two young Marines confronting her. When Vance continued shouting, his sharp voice carrying a hint of enjoyment, Cole felt a surge of heat run down his spine. He had seen plenty of disrespect in the military, but rarely had he seen anyone aim it at a living legend. Without thinking twice, he pulled out his phone and dialed Sergeant Major Alden. When the line picked up, Cole's voice came out almost as a growl. "Sergeant Major, the kids are disrespecting Helena Ward." Just one sentence. No embellishment needed. A brief silence followed, as if that alone was the reply, before Alden's deep, cutting voice came through. "You're certain I'm looking right at it? Hold your position." At headquarters, Alden immediately called Colonel Rourke into the room. When the name Helena Ward appeared on the screen, both men froze. The words Medal of Honor at the top of her file struck like lightning. The list of actions beneath it. Firebase Helios shielding wounded Marines under fire, taking command, when the entire unit was overwhelmed, brought back everything they'd ever heard about the Phoenix of Helios, the woman warrior who rose from the ashes of one of the deadliest battles. Alden said nothing else. Rourke asked no questions. "Get the cars. Now." 4 simple words enough to set the entire building in motion. Back at the scene, Vance had no idea the storm was already racing toward him. He continued blocking Helena, his face flushed red, his tone thick with judgment. "You're in serious violation, ma'am. Staying silent won't help you. Keep this up and I swear I'll have the MPs cuff you." People around them murmured nervously. Some were annoyed. Others leaned toward Vance simply because the voice of a low-ranking Marine sometimes sounded louder than truth. Harlow stepped back half a pace, but his eyes remained full of doubt. "Vance is right. No one with MOS 0369 looks like that." Those words landed in the air and struck the red jacket like icy needles. Yet Helena still didn't speak. She kept her hand on the metal object in her pocket, the small star her squad had given her as their final farewell. The moment her fingertips brushed it, she remembered why she was still standing here, for the ones who would never walk out of Firebase Helios again. Her silence created an invisible gulf between her and the two young Marines. The more Vance spoke, the clearer the gap between their worlds became. One world belonged to youth untouched by war. The other belonged to someone who had seen every shadow of it. Suddenly, Vance moved close enough that his breath brushed against her face. "You think being silent scares me?" Helena met his eyes for a second. Not with anger, not with defiance, but with a deep, aching compassion. The kind of look that made Harlow involuntarily step back another half-foot. Vance opened his mouth to speak again, but the first rumble of approaching engines drowned him out. Low, heavy, firm, unmistakable. The crowd turned. Several Marines blinked in shock. Vance's voice died instantly, his head snapping toward the sound on instinct. A command vehicle appeared at the corner. Then another. Then a Humvee behind them. The familiar blue government plates shifted the mood immediately. Young Marines nearby stood straighter, their expressions tightening. The confidence in Vance's posture began to crack. Helena didn't move. Her hand remained on the metal star. She knew the arrival wasn't for her. It was for the truth the boys had refused to see. The vehicles rolled to a stop. Doors opened with a series of heavy, final-sounding thuds. Colonel Rourke stepped out first, followed closely by Sergeant Major Alden. Their polished shoes hit the pavement like punctuation marks, ending the arrogance that had filled the space only moments before. And in the instant before power shifted hands, everyone understood that what happened next would no longer be a matter between just 3 people, but a matter for an entire force. The two command vehicles had barely stopped when the air in front of the base exchange seemed to sink, as if an invisible hand had pressed down on everyone present. The crowd fell completely silent as Colonel Rourke stepped out of the car, followed by Sergeant Major Alden, the man many considered the backbone of the entire installation. No one spoke, but the expressions on their faces alone made the younger Marines straighten instinctively. Rourke didn't look at Vance. He didn't look at Harlow. He didn't ask what had happened. He walked in a direct, unwavering line toward Helena Ward, the woman still standing calmly amid the commotion, her hands resting quietly inside the pockets of her red jacket. Alden followed half a step behind, solid as a pillar of stone. When the two of them stopped just a few feet in front of Helena, the crowd held its breath. And then, in a perfectly unified motion, Rourke and Alden came to attention, standing tall and rigid, and raised their hands in the most formal salute the United States military could offer. There was no hesitation in the gesture, no hint of reluctance, not even a glance toward the trembling young Marines behind them. That was a salute reserved only for someone who carried the nation's highest honor. The crowd was stunned. The young Marines who had been chatting and laughing moments earlier immediately stood at attention, despite no order being given. A few older service members placed their hands over their hearts, as if they were witnessing the living embodiment of the Corps' values standing before them. Helena responded with a gentle nod. Her face showed no pride, only humility, the kind of humility carried naturally by those who have walked through war and survived it. Rourke lowered his salute first, but the respect in his eyes never wavered. He turned to address everyone present, speaking clearly, not loudly, but with enough weight that every corner could hear. "The way they treated you is unacceptable." The words rang out like a verdict. Vance went pale. Harlow stood frozen like stone. Neither dared breathe. Rourke continued, his voice deep and cold. "No one, and I repeat, no one on this base has the right to disrespect someone who carries the honor of this nation. Someone who paid with blood and with the lives of their brothers so the rest of us can stand here today." Each word fell like a hammer onto the pride of the two young Marines. Harlow lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Vance stammered soundlessly, his shoulders shaking more from shame than fear. Alden stepped forward slightly, his voice rough and resonant. "Sergeant Major Helena Ward is not just a veteran. She is one of the names written into the history of the Marine Corps. She is the Phoenix of Helios. Every one of us owes her." A quiet wave moved through the Marines watching. Some swallowed hard. Others lifted a hand to their shoulder, as if reminding themselves to stand straighter. Helena remained still, her shoulders relaxed. She did not look at the two young Marines with anger. Her eyes held only a brief sadness, the sadness of someone who understood that youth must sometimes collide with truth before it can grow. And within that sadness was the determination of someone who had endured too much to waste energy on anger. Rourke turned back to her, speaking with a tone rarely heard from a colonel. "Ma'am, on behalf of this entire base, I offer my deepest apology. No one has the right to judge you. No one has the right to doubt you. What you have done, this whole force remembers." The crowd waited silent for Helena's response. She spoke only one sentence, barely above a whisper. "I don't need apologies. I just need them to understand." Rourke's eyes softened. Alden nodded slowly, as if to say she was right. Vance and Harlow could only bow their heads now. No one told them to do it. But they did because in front of them was no longer a woman they misunderstood. It was the undeniable truth standing in plain sight. And as the respect finally settled into its rightful place, everyone sensed the next moment coming. The moment when the story behind that honored name would finally be revealed. Sergeant Major Alden stepped forward, reaching into his breast pocket to retrieve a laminated card. The Medal of Honor citation he always carried to remember those who had brought honor to the force. The crowd leaned slightly toward him, drawn in by the weight of the moment without realizing it. When Alden unfolded the card, the faint rustle of paper was enough to make several young Marines flinch. His voice rose deep and clear, every word placed into the air with deliberate respect. "Gunnery Sergeant Helena Ward, United States Marine Corps, displayed extraordinary heroism far beyond the call of duty during the battle at Firebase Helios." Alden paused for a beat, then continued. "For 3 straight hours, while the casualty collection point was under heavy enemy fire, she used her own body as a shield, protecting 3 wounded Marines from direct bursts." A sharp exhale broke from someone in the crowd. Not out of surprise, but because the image alone was enough to send chills through anyone who understood what that meant. Alden read on, his voice steady, though his eyes darkened. When most of the unit had been wounded or killed, Helena Ward continued to command the defensive line, holding her position, directing fire and administering aid despite sustaining shrapnel injuries to her shoulder and leg. A young Marine in the crowd clenched his arm instinctively as if he could feel the sting of that shrapnel himself. Because of her actions, 7 Marines survived, and Firebase Helios was not overrun that day. The crowd fell completely silent. Not the silence of curiosity, but the silence of horror mixed with reverence. Harlow stared at the ground, his face burning with shame. Vance stood rigid, mouth slightly open as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Alden folded the card again, his hand shaking just barely, the kind of tremor seen only in men who remembered exactly what war had taken from them. Then he turned to Helena and bowed his head, a gesture almost never given to a retired sergeant major. Behind them, an older veteran, once a staff sergeant in Iraq, lifted his hand in a quiet salute. No one ordered him to do it. No one needed to ask why. He had recognized a true warrior. A second veteran saluted, then a third. Soon, an entire line of veterans stood at attention, heads bowed to Helena. Helena's eyes shifted, softening for just a moment, as though those old memories were brushing against a tender corner of her heart she usually kept locked away. No words were needed. Those who had walked through fire understand each other without speaking. Colonel Rourke stepped forward, shedding the sternness he usually wore. He looked straight at Vance and Harlow, as though staring directly into the heart of their mistake. Lance Corporal Vance, Corporal Harlow. The two names struck the young Marines like someone had grabbed them by the collar. Rourke continued, his voice low and heavy. You will report in 1 hour, in full service Alpha. Bring your entire chain of command, and you will explain why you chose to insult someone who carries the highest honor our nation can bestow. The sentence fell like a funeral bell tolling over their pride. Vance lowered his head. For the first time since the incident began, he had no argument left inside him. Harlow swallowed hard, his hands twisting together as if he wished he could disappear. Colonel Rourke turned back to Helena, his tone gentler, yet still filled with solemnity. Sergeant Major Ward, we owe you our gratitude and the respect you deserve. Helena simply nodded. Not proud, not angry. Just calm, the kind of calm found in someone who has lived long enough to understand that honor isn't loud. Honor is the quiet way a person stands tall, even when they are insulted. The crowd began to change. The young faces that had seen Helena as just another stranger now looked at her as a living emblem, a page of Marine Corps history, stepping out into daylight. And as the silence deepened, they began to grasp that some people had sacrificed nearly everything so that they themselves could stand safely here today. And in that moment, as the truth settled in and held everyone still, Helena felt something else rising inside her, not anger, but a responsibility to pass on the lesson she had purchased with blood. Colonel Rourke hadn't even turned to issue his next order when Helena quietly raised her hand, a small movement, yet enough to stop him in his tracks. She didn't look at Rourke. She looked directly at Vance and Harlow, two faces still tight with shame, regret, and the collapse of their earlier certainty. Sir, Helena said, her voice low but firm, punishment isn't the most important thing right now. Rourke tilted his head, acknowledging that she saw something he could not from his position as commander. Helena stepped forward. No one stopped her. No one dared. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes carried a lifetime of discipline, loss, and compassion. She halted in front of Vance and Harlow. Neither of them dared lift their heads. She spoke not loudly, not harshly, but with enough clarity that everyone nearby heard each word. The problem isn't the standard. The two young Marines froze. The standards keep us alive, Helena continued. The standards aren't wrong. But you applied them wrong. Because what guided you wasn't discipline. It was prejudice. A ripple of stillness swept through the crowd. A few people swallowed hard. Those who had witnessed injustice in the military before understood prejudice could kill faster than bullets. Helena looked straight at Vance, who by now was pale and trembling. You looked at me and thought you knew who I was, she said. But a Marine does not guess. A Marine verifies. A Marine observes. A Marine remains fair. Harlow whispered, barely audible, Ma'am, we were wrong. But Helena shook her head slowly. Wrong not because you lacked knowledge. Wrong because you believed appearance determines a person's worth. She paused, looked down at her own hands. For one brief moment, Helena's eyes changed as if she were seeing past the parking lot, past the present moment, into the face of someone long gone, a young Marine, a face smeared with mud and blood, eyes full of fear yet still searching for her as their anchor. She had shielded him with her own body. He hadn't survived. The memory passed quickly, but it was enough to make Helena close her eyes for a single heartbeat. When she opened them again, her voice dropped deep and steady, like the wind at the end of the day. At Firebase Helios. I learned one thing: a good gatekeeper doesn't only look for threats. They learn to recognize heroes. And that is much harder. The sentence fell into the air like a vow. The crowd grew so quiet that every breath could be heard. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. And slowly, the young Marine's expressions shifted from confusion to respect, then to reflection. Vance finally lifted his head, eyes red, speaking with a trembling but sincere tone. "Sergeant Major, I'm sorry. I don't deserve to wear this uniform in front of you." Helena didn't scold him. She didn't rebuke him. "Deserve or not," she said, "is something you prove with your actions tomorrow, not with the shame you feel today." The words hit Vance hard, not because they hurt, but because they landed directly on the deepest part of a Marine, his sense of honor. Harlow bowed his head as well, but Helena simply added, "Learn to look again, learn to verify, and learn to respect. That's how you grow." The air in front of the exchange seemed to slow, as though everyone was absorbing each word she spoke. And in Helena's eyes, instead of anger, there remained only compassion, a strength few who have gone through war still manage to keep. She stepped back half a pace, giving the two young Marines room to breathe again. The entire area fell into a thick, absorbing silence, not the silence of tension, but the silence of a lesson being etched into memory. And within that silence, something larger was beginning to unfold, across the base, not through orders, but through the respect owed to the woman who had just reminded them of a soldier's true duty. After that turbulent afternoon, the military base began to change in ways no one had expected. Colonel Rourke issued a new directive. Every unit was required to undergo training on proper ID verification procedures, professional conduct, and the history of the women who had led the way in combat roles. It was more than just a class. It was a reminder that ignorance can become an invisible weapon, one capable of inflicting wounds no one should ever have to suffer. In the days that followed, new posters appeared on bulletin boards throughout the buildings. In the most prominent corner of the main conference room hung a single-framed photograph, Helena Ward in her dress blues on the day she received the Medal of Honor. Her face calm, her gaze steady, not proud, but unshakably resolute. Beneath the photo was a small line of text, "The Phoenix of Helios, the bearer of honor's light." Young Marines walking past the photograph would slow their steps. No one told them to. They stopped to read her name, to study the image, to understand that behind that simple red jacket was a generation that had sacrificed so they could grow up in peace. Additional training sessions were scheduled on weekends. They reviewed the history of women in combat units. They learned about the pioneers and about those who never lived long enough to tell their stories. And the name Helena Ward became the centerpiece of every lesson about courage and responsibility. As time passed, the confrontation outside the exchange stopped being viewed as an incident. It became a lantern illuminating the mistakes people must correct with understanding and respect. Some of the younger Marines retold the story to newcomers. They didn't talk much about Vance or Harlow. They talked about Helena, the woman who stood still as stone before the noise of prejudice, the woman who didn't need to raise her voice to remind an entire base of what honor really meant. A month later, on an ordinary morning at the gym, Helena was doing pull-ups when she heard slow, hesitant footsteps approaching behind her. She let herself drop down, turned around, and saw Vance standing at a distance just far enough to avoid intruding, but close enough to show he had gathered his courage to speak. Vance wore workout clothes, none of the uniform that had once made him arrogant. He looked much younger and much humbler. He bowed his head, hands clasped together, as if afraid Helena's eyes could see straight through the remorse weighing inside him. "Sergeant Major," Vance began, his voice raspy from nerves, "I want to apologize. I have no excuse. I was wrong. Wrong in a way no Marine is ever supposed to be wrong." Helena stayed silent for a few seconds, studying him with eyes far gentler than they had been that day. It was the calm of someone who had seen both sides of war, the side that destroys and the side that allows people to change, and she saw in Vance something she had always believed: youth can be repaired. "I accept your apology," Helena said softly. Vance exhaled like someone being pulled away from the edge of a cliff. But Helena didn't walk away yet. She looked straight at him, her voice slow but sharp. "Lance Corporal, do one thing for me." Vance straightened at once, the way a Marine does when awaiting an order. "Be the kind of gatekeeper who can recognize the light," Helena said. "Don't just look for the wrong. Learn to see the worth in a person before you judge." Her words were like a legacy passed down to a new generation, not poetic, not loud, but powerful enough to change the way someone served the uniform on their back. Vance answered with only one sentence, "I promise." He walked away, but his steps no longer belonged to someone drowning in shame. They were the steps of someone who had just been given a chance to become better. The story of Helena Ward and the two young Marines never appeared in newspapers. No statue was built. No ceremony was held. But the tale spread across the base like a quiet reminder that courage isn't found only in the trenches, but in the way people correct themselves, learn, and treat others with respect. To those who met Helena, she wasn't just the legend of Helios. She was the proof that honor doesn't shout. It lives in action, in calm, and in forgiveness given at the right moment. Veterans' legacy stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please share this video and subscribe to Veterans' Legacy Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.